Okay, so good morning to you all. I welcome you to the first webinar of the European ALARA Network with challenges in applying the radiation protection system in the management of NORM and Radon. I'm very happy that the webinar gained so much interest and welcome you all. First of all, I want to thank my colleague Karin Nistler from the Austrian Agency for Food and Health Safety for her excellent technical support and for the possibility to make this webinar possible. Thank you very much, Karin. And as next, I want to give the word to Sylvain Andres.
Thank you, Franz. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Sylvain Andres. I'm the scientific secretary of the European ALARA Network. And I'm sure you are all very familiar with webinar, but just give you the rules of the game. As Franz said, this is very attended. There are more than 168 participants. So the idea is that no camera, no microphone for the participant. You can use the chat to ask questions to the speakers or for the roundtable. The meeting will be recorded and the video will be posted on YouTube later on. And just to diffuse any more questions, and the slideshow, the PowerPoint, it will be posted on the EAN website after. So now I will hand it over to Fernand, the chairperson of the European ALARA Network.
Good morning, dear participants. Also welcome to the European ALARA webinar on the challenges in applying the radiation protection system in the management of NORM and Radon. So I'm Fernand Vermeers. I'm the chairman of the European ALARA Network. Our network is a platform to exchange experience on radiation protection and practical optimization. So it's a place to come together and discuss how we can protect and optimize. Now, why this topic? Radon and NORM. Well, as we look at both exposures, we see that they are sometimes categorized in existing exposure situations, but also in planned exposure situation. Question is, how do we manage these exposure situations? How do we optimize these exposures? What do we use? Reference levels, dose constraints? What are the reference levels and the dose constraints that are appropriate? ICRP also recognized that further clarification is needed. So that's what we will explore this morning. To do this, of course, we will not do this alone, but we have 5 speakers from France, Norway, Czech Republic, UK, and Italy that will introduce the topic, and then we will have also the capability to have a round table and also discuss and answer some questions. So you have seen your hosts for today, Sylvain, Franz, and Karin. They will help you through the morning. So with no further ado, I will go to the first speaker of today, that's Jean-François Lecomte. He's a co-author of ICRP 2014 and 2019 publication. He's emeritus, but he is still very active in the radiation protection world. And he will enlighten us on the ICRP views on radon and on NORM. I give the floor to Jean-François. So please, Jean-François, you can start with your presentation.
Now I try to share my talk. Is it okay for you?
Full screen, Jean-François.
Full screen. Now it's okay?
Go on.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Fernand. Thank you for the organizer for giving me the opportunity to explain the ICRP approach about Radon and NORM. This approach is coming from two publications, publication 126 about Radon and publication 142 about norms. This slide just to remind you the key element of the system of protection. In the middle, you see the three principles, and these principles are applied in different exposure situations for different categories of exposure, using different criteria and with some requisites. And we will see how it works for Radon and NORM. First, let me remind you also the characteristic of Radon and NORM exposure, important in terms of radiation protection. In both cases, natural radionuclide already exist and they are not used for their radioactive properties. In both cases, there is no real prospect for emergency, for tissue reaction, for immediate danger of life. In both cases, we have ubiquity and variability of the exposure. Exposure can be anticipated, yes, but the right level of the exposure is not known before a characterization of the situation. And in both cases, we have or we could have internal exposure, and it is difficult to prevent. In both cases, we have a lack of culture of the different stakeholders. And we have two other characteristics specific for NORM, which are multi-hazard situation in which radiological risk is rarely dominant, and with a limited option for the management of residues and waste. Based on these characteristics, ICRP considers that Radon and NORM exposure are existing exposure situations. In terms of categories of exposure, we could have occupational exposure, but not all workers are considered as occupationally exposed. We could have public exposure and environmental exposure. And there is a room for a both integrated and graded approach, which is recommended. About the principles, the justification is applied on the protection strategy, not on the human activity itself. After a characterization, and with some priorities to be defined. In case of radon, it is radon-prone area or some buildings. In case of NORM, we have a national list of activities with NORM, using NORM. Optimization of the protection, it is a driving principles applied in terms of prevention or mitigation as low as reasonably achievable, taking into account the prevailing circumstances, and using reference levels expressing concentration as far as radon is concerned. About the application of dose limit, normally it is not relevant because it is existing exposure situation, but ICRP recognize that they can be applied for regulatory purpose. Now, let's have a look at the integrated and graded approach for radon and for NORM. Integrated approach for radon. ICRP recommend to manage radon exposure as far as possible at the level of the building, whatever its occupant. It is in a perspective of public health, as WHO mentioned rightly. You could have dwellings, workplaces, and mixed-use buildings, but we recommend to use a unique reference level and the same approach. This approach should be straightforward and realistic. For example, we don't recommend to make distinction between smoker and non-smoker, and we have no specific requirement for children. Also, it is recommended in terms of integration to have a combination with indoor air quality and energy saving policies. With tobacco, it is more difficult because smoking is an addiction, while radon is a pollution. We had to address both health, economic, architectural, and educational issues in an integrated view. And the general opinion is to address both the highest exposure and the global risk, because the global risk is generally due for low and moderate concentration. In terms of graded approach with Radon, the first issue is the selection of the reference level in the range between 100 and 300 becquerel per cubic meter. Then we have some choice. In the National Action Plan, we need to set some priorities. I already mentioned radon-prone area or some building. The approach is through prevention and mitigation for existing and new buildings. The requirement could be an incentive or mandatory, and we have to provide a long-term strategy, and then this strategy can be graded as such. We recommend a specific graded approach for workers with 3 levels. First, you manage the building, whatever the occupant, with a reference level in concentration. If it is not sufficient, then you manage at the level of the worker using a reference level in dose in the order of 10 millisievert per year. And if it is not sufficient, then you go to occupational exposure, if I can say that. But and it could be when the dose the reference level is exceeded, or in some specific activities and facilities set in a national list. And in that case, the workers who are not considered as occupational exposed are treated in the same way as members of the public, with some arrangement, I mean, in terms of assessment and recording of the exposure. Another element of the graded approach is to recommend managing radon and other radiation separately by pragmatism. Now, what about NORM? The integrated approach for the workers, it is starting with the protection strategy already in place or planned for management of workplaces hazard, I mean hygiene and safety at work, and then you integrate as necessary specific radiological protective action to complement this strategy. For the environment, we have also an integrated approach, all hazard, radiological and non-radiological stressors, and all impact human and ecological. Ecological, it is non-human species. The graded approach for NORM. First, for workers, we have a graded approach in the selection of the reference level. Generally, it is less than a few millisievert per year in most cases, but it could be higher, and generally, rarely exceeding 10 millisievert per year. Graded approach also by starting with collective protective action and continue with individual ones. We have 2 series, and they are developed in the publication. Collective action are related to the workplace and condition of work, while individual are related to each worker individually. Graded approach also in the implementation of protective action, which could be more or less thoroughly. About public exposure, we start with a characterization, who is exposed, when, where, and how, and then we optimize with some compartment. I mean, we separate discharges, waste, recycled residues, and you apply optimization in this element. It is a part of the graded approach. Also, with the selection of the reference level, generally less than a few millisievert per year, and by including stakeholder involvement. Graded approach for the environment, it is a step-by-step approach. Start with a generic assessment, continue, if necessary, with a specific assessment, and if it is necessary, you make a detailed environmental impact assessment. And you can use the tools provided by specific publication of ICRP, I mean the RAPS, the DCRL, and so on, as appropriate. And again, the stakeholder involvement. About ethical consideration, I have no time to develop. They are developed in the publication 138. I just mentioned the fact that the issue of tolerability is challenging with both radon and NORM. I mean, the question, what means unacceptable in both cases? The answer is not so evident. And in conclusion, we can see that we have many similarities between radon and NORM exposure. Radon is the main exposure in several processes involving NORM. It is why there are some similarities. And the key recommendations are, first, to characterize the situation. Secondly, to justify the protection strategy and not the activity itself. And then to apply optimization of the protection through an approach which is both integrated and graded. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation.
Is it okay for the sharing? Okay.
Is there any question? You can write it in the chat. Okay, otherwise.
There are several questions. I don't know if we'll reserve the question of Mika for now or for the roundtable.
I think maybe we can ask a question from Mika, because you presented the ICRP system in less than 10 minutes, which is
okay.
quite a good score. And the question from Mika is, you presented justification after the characterization. And the question is, could it be possible that, for example, a NORM exposure situation could be deemed as non-justified from the beginning? Because, for example, we are digging a hole and etc. And we know from the beginning that we will have some NORM with radium and exposure situation. And from that outset, in the design, is it possible, in your opinion, that an exposure situation could be not justified from the beginning?
In the opinion of ICRP, as I said, the answer is that we should apply the justification only on the protection strategy and not on the human activity, even in case of a new activity, because we don't know exactly what will be the exposure, and it's difficult for. And another point is that the radiological risk is very rarely dominant, and then it would be difficult to stop engaging an activity only because of radiation protection. And perhaps we could find out one or two examples of that, but we cannot build a strategy on some exception. In the very general case, it is not relevant to apply justification to the activity, the industrial activity. We need to be pragmatic and efficient.
Thank you. Then I think one question from Mr. Sanchez is.
Hello, good morning. Good presentation, Jean-Francois. I have a question. How the ICRP consider the person that work inside the NOR industry? Because sometimes we wanted to use it to apply like a exposure worker, and sometimes it's considered like a public. Now I have a contradiction, because I am working in the on-scale subgroup 2 related with the NOR exposure, and in scale they wanted to consider the worker inside the industry like a exposure worker, not like a public. And this is not true. It's not true in several countries. Well, how is the position of ICRP about that situation?
In fact, the ICRP recommend to protect the workers, but in an adapted way. What it means, you can apply the occupational exposure, and in some cases, for NORM involving for industries involving NORM, it is relevant. But you have to keep in mind that what we call occupational exposure, I mean the specific requirements, the specific procedure, and so on, has been set mainly having nuclear industries in mind, and potential medical practices too. But and because of that, and because we need to be vigilant every time, and because we in these industries we use edge sources with a great potential of danger. The system for occupational exposure has been very developed with very many constraints and so on, and also many specificities in terms of procedure, in terms of expertise, in terms of accreditation, and so on. And it is not always relevant for cases in which the radiation risk is incident. Of course, we have to protect the worker. You have to take some requirement already provided for occupational exposure, but the implementation could be more, I would say, with less weight, and it is sufficient, totally sufficient for the protection of workers. You don't need to have specific RPO or RPE and so on. You have to use the already the protection and safety already in place, and to adapt as relevant the requirement for radiation protection. You see, it is a matter of graded approach. Okay, you could have a graded approach also in planned exposure situation with some requirements which are not used, but in fact, as far as you have the so-called occupational exposure, you have so many specificities that then it could be difficult for when the exposure is not real at stake. It does not mean that it is relaxing, but it is adapting the protection.
Okay, thank you very much, Jean-François. Let's keep questions in mind for the roundtable in the end. And let's go to the next speaker, V Holmstrand from Norway, which shows us practical experiences from Norway in NORM remediation.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can find my presentation. Let's see. Do you see the presentation or the?
We see the presentation mode.
Okay, just let's try to.
So if you could just switch it again, like on top.
Yes.
In the middle, on top, where it says Visning, the other one, just to the right.
It's,
yes.
Of course, it's let's try like this, and it's quite typical that this worked perfectly during the during testing. Visning's alternative, I think. No, that's not the one. Typical. I'll just try to do it like this. Now I think. Just a second.
Yeah, we see it perfectly now.
No, it's okay.
Yeah. Okay, practical experience from Norway in NORM remediation. And as we have heard, there are many nice ways to think about this, but our experience is that it may be somewhat more difficult than expected. Just a brief overview. I'm going to talk briefly about NORM in Norway, and then I'm going to go on to intentionally acidifying rocks, because this is the topic of my presentation. I'm going to talk about when the risk is not accepted, environmental hazards and risks, ecosystem assessment in multiple stressor environment, economical consequences, the need for specialized knowledge, and also the question, what is enough knowledge to base a decision on? And of course, the conclusion. When it comes to NORM in Norway, we have quite a lot. Based on the list of NORM industries from the EU, and the agency, there are quite a few NORM industries in Norway. One of the most, the largest one is petroleum, oil and gas. The picture is from decommissioning of a petroleum platform, so it's quite huge, and it's a lot of NORM in that one. We also have some mineral industry. At the present time, we have the titanium dioxide, and also in the future, we will potentially have rare earth element industry. We have some residues from metal mining and milling, especially molybdenum and niobium smelter residues. And also we have fertilizer and phosphate industry. In addition, we have several cases where natural processes cause formation of NORM pollution or waste, such as when groundwater hits the outside of panels in tunnels, which may cause a buildup of radium. We also have the typical acid mine drainage from abandoned mines, and also the potentially acidifying rocks, which this topic is concerning. The potentially acidifying rocks, which we call PAR for short because it's a quite long name, is the absolute largest volume of Norwegian radioactive waste. The PARs are black shales with an acid-forming potential. They are chemically reactive and has an exothermic oxidative reactions. And it contains a very long list of heavy metals, which may be a problem for the environment. And also uranium and thorium can be found in it, and also the decay products. It is also a source of radon, but I'm not going to talk about radon in this presentation. We also have a large potential for pollution, and therefore it is the form of waste regulated by the Pollution Control Act and waste regulations. It is relatively expensive and challenging to handle compared to other types of rock. As for most the regulators, we experience that the responsible party sometimes do not want to do the expensive actions and try to find alternative ways to handle wastes. And one challenge for the regulator is that PARs are everywhere. And we are depending on the entrepreneurs to act in accordance with legal requirements, and not just to the best understanding. Other ways from nuclear installation, research, and hospitals, and so on, and also other NORM industries are accounted for, but PARs are more difficult to account for, since they are occurring practically everywhere, especially in the southeast parts of Norway. And of course, when the responsible party don't think that the hazards apply for their waste, the search for alternative ways to handle this can cause unsafe ways to handle this. When it comes to the environmental hazard and risk, we find that PARs has an intrinsic hazard with regards to the chemical reactivity and potential for release of heavy metals and radionuclides. The risks from these wastes come when the responsible party do not handle these wastes in safe manner. Because PARs, if they are exposed to oxygen and water, they start to oxidize and also to cause acidifying conditions, and also to release especially uranium. And this causes a quite high potential exposure for biota to radiation. As I said, there are many heavy metals in addition to uranium and thorium. So we have an issue with a multiple stressor environment. And it's quite difficult, both because of that we don't have a good measure to assess radioactive and chemical toxicity compared to each other in one assessment system. We also need to work together with other environmental protection authorities for mutual support and sharing experience. When you look at this table, I pointed out some metals, which in addition to uranium was found in water close to potentially PARs that were left out in nature. And for aluminium, cadmium, chromium, copper, nickel, and zinc, the levels were enough to be toxic by itself. Yes, and also, as I said, he said we need modeling tools for multiple stressors, and that's quite challenging. And we also have the economical consequences, as some remediation actions may be quite expensive. We have one case where parts are under a road, and removal and rebuilding of roads are very expensive. And then in addition, we have, for instance, quick clay, which are under this road. But still, the question is still, how can we assess the economic value of the environment and the result of the remediation against the cost of the remediation? When must we say that this is too expensive? Another challenge is that we need specialized knowledge. As you all know, these diagrams and this reaction, but it's not, our experience is that it's not very common knowledge. And there are complicated assessments with regards to chemical behavior of NORM, and we have very varying degree of knowledge. And it's not easy to find qualified consultants for the enterprises. In addition, it's challenging to communicate hazard risks and the need for necessary countermeasures, especially when the responsible party does not think that it is important enough to do the remediation. Another question is, what is enough information to base a decision on? The foundation of a decision needs to be good enough to weigh the need for remediation actions against cost. And again, it is difficult to assess the value of the environment in itself. And also we have demands in Norwegian legislation to sufficiently evaluate the effect of the cases. But also it's a legislative claim that even in cases where the knowledge is somewhat limited, this cannot be enough to not do necessary remediation actions. And we also must assume that the decision will be subject of complaints. All involved parties need sufficient knowledge of NORM pollution and wastes. And going through our cases, we have found out that at least the regulator needs to provide enough and understandable guidance. This can save time and money both for the enterprises and the regulator. So in the last year, we have developed some guidance, and we have used recommendations from the agency. We have looked through our earlier cases, requested and got input from international experts, other Norwegian environmental agencies, and some selected companies that had cases with NORM handling and or remediation earlier. Of course, the issue now is that the guidance may be a little too detailed, but it's in the pipeline and hopefully it will be released soon, and I hope that the guidance will help out. In conclusion, NORM remediation is challenging, expensive. It's necessary in some cases, despite its challenges and expenses, and we must expect that the decision will be subject to complaints. Thank you for your attention, and I point to the points of contact in the future. It's Lene Valle, Senior Advisor, and Head of Section Ingeborg Mork Knutson. So I hope this was clarifying.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentations. Are there any questions?
Says what's typical uranium concentration? It's it may vary from it differs. I think one of the challenging cases, it has as low as 0.3 becquerels per gram, but it can also be above 1 becquerel per gram, so it's quite low. But because of the acidifying processes, the potential for pollution is so high, and the exposure of biota is quite high as well. So even though the activity concentration of the alum shale or the pores itself are quite low, the hazard is far higher than you should imagine. And I think that's one of the issues with trying to regulate these wastes, because it's it may be quite low content of radionuclides, but the hazard is quite high.
Thank you. Pascal, may I ask you to ask your question, which you have written in the chat? Okay. Pascal wrote. Also.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I put a question following a visit I made in Kinsarvik in Norway on the radon issue. But I think there are similarities because also there are radon levels which are very high at that place. We met people who didn't want to talk too much about this situation. And from your opinion, do you think is it a denial or is it a lack of information about the risk they are exposed to? And why are the experts, and for instance, DSA experts, because I was with DSA expert at that place, why are they no longer welcome at this kind of place?
It's quite difficult to answer because I haven't talked to these people myself, but in general, there may be an unwillingness to accept hazards and risks. Of course, it's difficult to understand what is the hazards and risk. When it comes to Kinsarvik, I'm just driving through the place, but from my understanding, it's a quite small village and the doses are quite high and you still don't see much effect, but it can be just for that the population is so small. And then when it's like, well, my grandma got 80 years old and she didn't have any ill effects and she lived here all the life. Why do you come here and try to tell me that this is not okay? Because I have seen with my own eyes that it is okay. So, and also when it comes to pollution, I think it's a kind of denial. It's like, well, it's not that high level of radionuclides, so why should I do some expensive remediation of this? It doesn't make sense. But looking through it and going as someone with some knowledge about it, you can tell that it's potential for actual effects, at least in biota when it comes to runoff from these pars. So I think it's perhaps, well, I don't want to speculate on their part, but in general, I think it's more like refusal to go into the hazards and risk. And your question, why are experts no longer welcome? I haven't been in Kinsarvik, so I don't know the particulars in that case.
Okay, thank you very much, Marte, again. Then if any question arises, we can keep it in mind for the roundtable. And let's go on to the next presentation from Katarina Navratilova-Rovenska from the Czech Republic, which gives us feedback on radiation protection for NORM facilities and underground workplaces.
Good morning. It seems to be that I cannot share still.
Should be
Thank
possible
you.
now.
Yeah. Now it is okay. So, can you see the presentation now?
Yes, we can see it.
Is it in a correct mode and moving?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Always is a big surprise whether I succeed or not. Good morning, everyone. As the title of my presentation was already introduced, I would just move to another slide just to introduce RadoNom project. I saw a lot of participants of this workshop who are part of the RadoNom, so I would be just quick for those who are not aware of this project. So RadoNom is an abbreviation for a much longer title, Towards the Effective Radiation Protection Based on Improved Scientific Evidence and Social Considerations, Focus on Radon and NORM. So this is how we how it fits to the topic of this workshop. The project has already 20 member states, 57 beneficiaries, and it should take 60 months. We should end in August 2025. And there is a list of main objectives. Of course, the implementation of the EU BSS into member states and to reduce scientific and social as well as technical uncertainties in all the steps of radiation risk management cycle for radon and NORM. And this is also how I try to this is the starting point for the presentation, because the information I found it's a crucial part of the assessment of exposure. Here is the chart of the work packages of the RadoNom project, and Suro is responsible for work package 5, and directly work packages 5.4 and 5.5 are directly connected to measurement, exposure assessment, and mitigation of underground workplaces and NORM workplaces. So this is how when I tried to prepare myself for the presentation, I was trying to summarize what are the crucial points for the assessment of exposure at the radon and NORM workplaces. And I found out that all the time the discussion starts and ends at the collection of data issue, that we need to have a sufficient and reliable data to describe the situation at the workplace, that we have to identify the source of radiation at the workplace, of course. We have to measure, to describe the variability of radon progenies concentration, variability of other sources of exposure, other radionuclides. There are also other factors which are influencing the assessment of exposure, and they are, or at least some of them, are highly variable. So to describe, to assess the exposure, to calculate the effective doses to the workers or the public, we need to be aware about the ranges of all the important quantities. We of course have to take into account the parameters of measurement devices, so we know what are we really able to measure. Then we have, of course, to identify the exposure pathways. We have to consider variation of workers' behavior or public behavior, like time spent at the workplaces or workplace, typical activities at the workplace, and so on. The first part I would like to dedicate to underground workplaces, especially focused on radon workplaces. And during the RadoNom project, we did a tiny little survey on which quantities are typically measured at underground workplaces, especially focused on measurements carried out for compliance with the legal framework, like what is required to be measured. And we found out that radon concentration and gamma dose rate are typical quantities measured at the workplaces, and only if necessary, humidity, temperature, concentration of radon progeny, soron, and soron progenies and unattached fraction is added to the basic set of measurements. We also found out that environment monitoring is used rather than personal dosimetry, which is quite easy to understand because environmental monitoring is usually much cheaper compared to personal dosimetry. But considering also short-term workplaces, randomly visited workplaces, at this, the environmental monitoring can be a challenge. Coming closer to the assessment of exposure or calculation of those, we have to select, in considering the environment monitoring, we have to select the measurement points where we put the measuring the devices or the detectors, either passive or active, and how many points should we select across the workplace. There are, of course, in many countries, national measurement protocols designed and implemented describing this, but sometimes we need to update the procedure based on the current situation on particular workplace. We also have to select carefully the duration of measurement, which should respect the seasonal variability of radioactivity concentration. As you can see on the left-hand side graph or chart, when you can see the switch of the ventilation regime in the underground workplace from the summer to winter time, and you can see the nice drop down of radon concentrations. And also, we have to consider the presence of workers at the particular workplace. And you can see on the right-hand side chart, the monthly averages of radioactivity concentration at the stops along the guided route in the underground workplace. It was show mine. And you can see the time development of radioactivity concentration at the measurement points and in 6 consecutive months. So this has to be considered as well. So how to select the monitor? How to be this the challenge to measure radon properly? We have there is a long list of parameters which should be considered, because the selection of the measurement device should be based on the purpose of the measurement. We have to at least to consider the sufficient measurement range, as you can see on the top graph, or also the response time of the detectors, because it can be like this on the radon concentration may behave like in this graph, where you can see quite frequent and steep changes of radon activity concentration at several measurement points located in across the underground show mine. Coming again closer to the those calculation, we know, and most of you are aware of a long and still ongoing discussion about the implementation of those conversion coefficients. We have our ICRP 65 document, which is the outcome, or the dose conversion convention was used for a long time and is still used in many countries. Recently, the ICRP 137 dose conversion coefficients were published and are implemented already in some of the member states, EU member states. And for the first time, the ICRP 137 also makes possible to calculate site-specific dose conversion factors if aerosol conditions are different from the assumed reference level. If there is evidence that it is necessary to calculate site-specific dose conversion coefficients, and of course we have also here. Those conversion coefficients, which are again used in some countries. So what does it mean to have sufficient and reliable data? the site-specific dose conversion factors, as prescribed in the Annex A of the publication 137 of ICRP, they are based on the unattached fraction and on the equilibrium factor. And on the charts, I wanted to illustrate the variability of these quantities, or here on the charts, there is the unattached fraction only between years and during the day. And you can see the black part are the working hours. So how long data sets do we need? Should the measurement be repeated during the season, during the operating season, or also between years? Because we can see there is a quite high variability. And what is also important to note here, that the unattached fraction does not have metrological traceability at the moment. So considering site-specific dose conversion factors seems quite catchy for some of the operators of workplaces. But there are also a lot of unknown things. Coming to norm workplaces, we have quite well-established procedures to describe permanent workplaces, but similarly to radon workplaces, temporary or short-term workplaces can be challenging to properly measure and collect sufficient amount of data to calculate the dose with the acceptable level of, on one hand, conservatism, on the other hand, not overestimating the doses. These type of these workplaces can be cleaning of gas piping, replacement of filtration material in water treatment facilities, or even demolition or reconstruction of norm workplaces, which some of them can become norm workplace thanks to the construction works. For example, buildings built of building material with elevated radium, usually radium-226 concentration. And of course, monitoring of legacy sites can be a challenge as well sometimes. By this slide, I would like to point out what I was mentioning by the sufficient level of conservatism, and also at the same time not to overestimating the doses. This is the example of workplace, which was actually a workplace because of elevated radium concentration in the building material, and it should be demolished. And having the on-site measurements, you can see the blueprint of the building and a list of measurement points that and in the table in the up part you can see the mean or the average ambient dose equivalent rates on the level of 0.5 microsievert per hour. But giving the workers the personal dosimeters, we could see that the ambient dose equivalent rate was much lower. And yes, this is just to show that there are also possibilities how to monitor independently the legacy sites, which can, at least when they are in the far distance or without the electricity connection, this can be challenged, but there are some possibilities how to do it. And coming to the end, I would like to show you one of the case study, which is not the workplace, but the method can be used and was already used to objectify the results of measurement, of radon measurement at the workplaces as well. It's air exchange rate measurement. Again, it could be used as a tool for radon diagnostics. It can be used for assessment of exfiltration, infiltration from the outside to improve those assessment in case of plume contamination and so on. But basically and mainly it is used to objectify the results of radon measurements to the minimum hygienic air exchange rate, which is prescribed at least in the Czech technical standards to 0.3 exchanges per hour. So there is a description of the method applied. I will just skip it and go directly to the case study. During the heating season, 2-month-long integral radon measurement was performed, and the radon activity concentration the average was found to be above the reference level. The short-term measurement in all of the habitable rooms of the building was repeated, or what was carried out, because the integral measurement was done only in 2 mostly occupied rooms. So the owner of the building decided to repeat the measurement in all of the habitable rooms because he was quite under pressure because of a fear from radon. And because the results were confirmed, the owner decided to file a lawsuit against the construction company and to request the remediation to reach radon activity concentration below the reference level. And we were asked to provide an expert opinion. So we did the 2 weeks measurement campaign using continuous radon monitors. The building was occupied all the time. The period was the end of April. And so you can see the chart from one of the rooms of the family house, and you can see that the mean of radon activity concentration was about 200 becquerels per meter cube, which is quite fine, and there was a maximum slightly above 400 during nights in Kinder's room. In parallel to radon measurement, we did the air exchange rate measurements, and they show that the average air exchange rate is quite low. It's only 0.12 changes per hour. So when recalculating the radon activity concentration to the standard ventilation, the resulting radon concentration was below 100 becquerel per meter cube. So no remediation at this moment was necessary. Only higher ventilation should be used as a mitigation, which is, yes, it's a mitigation. And this is the final, let's say, conclusion of my presentation, that we really need a detailed measurement at the workplace as a first step towards the exposure assessment and, if necessary, to design the effective remedial measure. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. We have quite some questions. To keep the timetable, I picked 2 short questions, and the rest I would suggest to keep in mind for the roundtable, which seem also more like this questions good to discuss. The first one is, how many measurement points have you selected?
Where?
Good question.
How many measurements? Like in the family house for the case study, or
no, it was before.
Okay.
It was the radon.
The underground workplace. Yeah, we are measuring at all of the guide stops along the path, and we are using, or the plan is to use these monthly measurements to evaluate the possible time spent at the particular point, and to discuss or to modify the guided route based on the development of radon concentration month to month.
Okay, thank you. And do you mean HP10 for individual monitoring?
It was a test. It was experimental work when we wanted to test which results we get from the on-site monitoring, like 1 meter high, 50 centimeters from the wall, and when the workers have the measurement device with them, and and considering or focusing on the change of the geometry between the worker and the source. So it was, we are not using it in practice. We use it. It was just a study.
Okay, thank you very much, Katharina.
Thank you.
I hope the other persons who posted questions don't mind if we keep them for the roundtable at the end. And now we've come to our mini break, which is about 10 minutes. So let's see us together at 10:45. So have a nice break and see you later.
Hello, everyone. It's, oh, that's a little bit, yeah. Just would like to say that I will be the chairman for this round number 2 of this webinar. Given that the level of chairmanship provided by France in the first part was extremely elevated, I hope to keep up. So be aware. And now I would like to introduce our third or fourth speaker, Mrs. Tracy Gooding. She's Principal Radiation Protection Specialist and Radon Group Leader at the UK Health and Security Agency. And she will talk about the new radon potential map in the United Kingdom. Tracy, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. Right. Okay.
We can see your slide. It's perfect. No longer. And you're muted.
Yeah, I've been having a network problem this morning, as you can see. Right, let's try sharing this again. Slideshow revealing. Right. Okay. Hopefully you can see my my presentation again. Radon measurements and the national survey, right through to the latest map, radon evolution.
Yes, we can. It's perfect.
Great. Excellent. Right. The main source of radon in the UK is the ground. We don't have a problem with building materials. They are not a significant source. There is not enough radon from the building materials that we use to put our indoor radon concentrations above any reference level. Most households also have public water supplies. So radon in water isn't a problem, so we concentrate on the ground. So as you know, small changes in geology can have a big influence on the radon concentration within a particular building. And After many years of working with radon, I am disappointed that we cannot predict the individual radon level in a building. All we can do is predict the radon potential. So every building is unique, but we can say what are the probabilities of this particular building exceeding a reference level. So in UK, our standard measurement is with a PADC integrating passive detector. We use them for 3 months over any time of the year and then apply a seasonal correction. So we can measure in the summer, our seasonal correction factor will increase the radon level to predict the annual average. If we're measuring now in the winter when it's extremely cold here, then we actually reduce the radon concentration to give you a prediction of the annual average radon concentration. And we use 2 in a house, 1 in a living area, 1 in a bedroom. And for workplaces, we use however many we need, but we don't map the radon concentrations for workplaces because they are too different. With houses, you have this homogeneous situation that you live in your house, you'll be sleeping in your house there sometime during the day. They are much more uniform, so much easier to map. So we've been creating radon maps from the 1980s onwards. This was from the National Survey, around 3,000 measurements across the country, and it concentrated areas of high population density. So the big cities such as London in Scotland, Edinburgh and Glasgow, Belfast in Northern Ireland, Cardiff in South Wales. As you can see, there were large areas of the country that were not mapped, but you can also see some of the color changes, the blues, the yellows, the reds, starting to show up areas of higher radon concentration. The national average was very low, but there were definitely some areas where there was a problem. And back in the 1980s, we used an action level for homes of 400 becquerel per meter cubed. Now we changed from a what we have measured to what we can predict map. The radon predicted maps was first created in 1990. And we also lowered our action level at the time. So that's our reference level for homes. It has stayed at 200 becquerel ever since. So it was considered quite low at the time. And some countries are still considering 200 becquerel per meter cubed to be difficult to achieve. And also the concept of radon affected areas. These are radon prone areas, radon priority areas, however you choose to call them. We have affected areas, and the definition was put in 1990. So the first affected areas were from southwest England, and it was done in a very free form way. Literally people just drawing on a map thinking this looks to be a high area. And so we needed to have areas where we had radon priority, but we also needed to classify them in perhaps a better way. But we also set ranges between 1% to 3% of homes up to more than 30% of homes likely to exceed the action level. They were a good choice of ranges because we've stayed more or less with those ever since. So to map areas in a more systematic way, we use the fact that radon levels are log normally distributed across various different areas, an area of your choice. So here's some data I've taken. You can see just plotted on an ordinary linear scale. That linear scale should go up to 4,000 becquerel per meter cubed on this particular group of data that I have selected. If you log normally distribute them, you can turn them into something much more familiar, more like a bell curve, and then you can use the geometric mean and the geometric standard deviation to see what percentage of your cohort is likely to exceed a certain reference level. And we've been using that ever since. So, sorry, skipped one there. Can we go up? Last viewed. We also started setting affected areas up in Scotland as well. These are some of the more interesting areas in Scotland, in Highland and in Grampian. But you can see, rather than freeform areas, we're starting to use grid squares and also local authority district areas, local government areas. One thing that did fascinate people was that the city of Aberdeen that you can see in Grampian, that is known as the Granite City. All the buildings are covered in granite or made of granite. However, that was not a radon affected area, which surprised a lot of people. So radon affected areas weren't just to encourage radon measurements and highlight where high radon levels were likely to be. They were also used for building regulations. If you know there's likely to be high radon levels in a building, why not build them radon proof? So started to change the construction of buildings to make them radon proof as far as we could. And these building regulations started in 1990. They are still in effect today. They have been slightly refined and updated with our radon affected areas. When it's also for new homes, new workplaces, and also any extensions, any new parts of the building, should consider putting radon preventive work. But it's not absolutely mandatory. The way the regulations are written, it should be installed, not must be installed. So there is sometimes a little bit of reluctance to put in radon prevention work. I think it needs a change in the law here. So we started to fill in the gaps in the radon map. Lot of measurements during the 1990s, a new change of color scheme, green to reddy black, and also starting to look at areas where we didn't have any people living. We have a high population density in many parts of the UK, but if you look at Scotland, for instance, there are places that we could not map. This is our geometric mean radon concentration, so this was going to be a very big influence on what the new radon affected areas were going to be. And we used various different color schemes. Blue was confusing to people because they thought it might be water or flooding. So we gradually completed the map on a 5-kilometre grid square resolution for most parts of England and Wales. There were lots and lots of measurements in southwest England, so we went down to 1-kilometre grid square. And various different methods were applied to smooth the data. For instance, if you had 20 measurements within a grid square and 5 of them were above the action level, you couldn't just say that was 25%. You were taking an influence from the grid squares around the one that you were measuring. And the way of doing that, I've given a reference in that particular slide. So the other areas of the UK, Scotland, a different color scheme again. It was starting at white and going to brown. I wish they would have decided on which color scheme they wanted to use a little earlier. And you also see that there are areas that we cannot map. And this is because nobody lived in those areas, or literally 1 or 2 people, and they did not want to have radon measurements. And this white color scheme started to confuse people. Although we mean it's not a radon affected area, it's not an area where you should be particularly thinking about radon, many people started to interpret this as either no radon or no measurements, and both of these were wrong. Northern Ireland mapped on a very fine resolution there, so we ended up with the entire country being wrapped on radon alone. Then we started to add in the geology. So since we know that the main source is the ground, why not include the geological classifications of every kind of rock, including with the radon? So combine those 2 situations. It means that you can look at a geology where there are no houses, but predict what the radon concentrations or the percentage of houses that are likely to exceed a reference level just by looking at the same geology elsewhere. This is called our joint dataset, JDS mapping. It was a much more complicated way of doing it. It didn't rely on just all the radon measurements that we had done, but it did need a lot of input from our national organisation for geology, the British Geological Survey. However, it meant that we could go to a crazy high resolution of 25-metre grid squares. That's 25 meters, so about the size of a house on a plot of land. So we then remapped the entire country on this 25-meter resolution. So here's something that's throwing in a slightly lower resolution, just so you can actually show it on a screen or in a paper map. But it did mean that if you wanted all the detail, and for every 1 kilometer grid square, you have 1,600 25-meter grid squares. You can have a lot of detail there. So this is when we went online in 2007. So if you wanted to know what the radon potential of your house, of the area in which you live, then you needed to look online. The map was the first indicator. The detail was only available on the internet. And here are all the references again. So that's where we have been, 2007, 2011, 2015. Now, 2007 for England and Wales, that map was starting to look rather old. So not only did we have lots of extra measurements, but British Geological Survey had updated their geological units throughout Great Britain. So that's England, Wales, and Scotland. Northern Ireland didn't have as many measurements and there was no geological update. So we are happy with that 2015 map. So what did we do? So the England and Wales map from 2007 contained 460,000 homes with radon measurements and 1,434 geological classifications. Scotland, a smaller number of both. Now, for the updated map, you can see we have another 100,000 houses with measurements, but the number of geological classifications has vastly increased. The complexity of the geological map has increased in a great deal. We also changed the statistical method to combine the radon measurements and the geology. So to create our lots of little bell curves, to make lots of little geometric means and geometric standard deviations, we reduced the number from 100 to 30, which allowed us to localize the map in greater detail. So this is what we have when we see geology. A geological unit can be maybe 5 centimeters across. It can be tiny. So we have to buffer it. We have to make it into something that we can map. So we map from the highest geological or the highest radon potential geological unit. You see, it gets very complicated, and put that to a 25-meter grid square. So it can turn something in very tiny, tiny detail into something that we can actually use and map statistically. Also gives you an idea of some new color schemes. So this is what our new radon potential map for the UK looks like. We have kept more or less the same ranges over the years, from 0 to 1%, that is not a radon affected area. Anything greater than 1%, greater or equal to 1%, is a radon affected area. So a whole new range of colors there. This helps us to promote the message that everywhere has been mapped. There is no area where we say there are no measurements or no radon, so we can remove that particular wrong interpretation. We can differentiate between different generations of maps. It's a whole new color scheme. So it immediately makes people using the yellow and brown maps out of date. And Northern Ireland, we did not remap, but we changed the colors to make it consistent. The advice remains the same. We have an action level of 200 becquerel per meter cubed. We keep the probability bands. We keep the same definition of radon affected area. Our building regulations still apply. And one thing we did need to remind people is that all basements or cellars are considered at risk despite the radon map. Don't look at the radon map if you've got anything underground. And that also goes for mines, caves, underwater facilities, water treatment works, these sorts of things. The information is available online for householders, landlords, and employers. Some of it is free, but a small amount of it you do have to pay for that service, especially if you want a large portfolio of properties assessed for your radon potential. It's not expensive, but it is something that we do have to charge for because it does fund a lot of our research work. So what's changed? Change is never popular. Some areas go up in radon potential, some areas go down in radon potential. So someone who's already done their radon measurement will say, I'm no longer in a radon affected area. Can I have my money back? And the answer is no, you now have your individual result for your individual house. And even if you are not in a radon affected area, you might have a high radon concentration. We never said you didn't, it's just you have a smaller chance. So some areas have moved up and down different bands, and this is where it gets very complicated to deal with people. So, heaven's sake, let's go to the previous last view, that one again. This is how complicated it gets for a new radon map. You have the technical detail of the final map. You have that's in blue, that's all the data that feeds into it, and all the people who are extremely interested in it. In grey, you have the government systems. These are the ones that are requiring approval and information. And you can see there the National Radon Action Plan Core Group. That was very, very useful in getting approval for the new map and getting information out to people. And then the last part is communications. And that has been a very, very big issue leading up to the new map, because it's not something that we just produce in a scientific journal. This is something that feeds through to building regulations, new housing construction, health and safety regulations, Housing Act, which is where you make landlords make sure your house is safe if you are renting. Building control officers, that's the local government officers who make sure new houses are built correctly. What else do we have? We made new FAQs, frequently asked questions, everything that we thought a journalist, a member of the public, health and safety officers would ask. I'm sure we've missed people. We just tried to think of as many people as possible using experience from all the different maps that we have published. One thing that was also different is that we only published online. We did not produce a paper report. And that's part of the government system, digital first. So communicating the changes, we had in various regular meetings, we said, yes, we're going to have a new map in 2022. It finally was published on the 1st of December. So we left it quite late in the year. A press release, email lists. We worked with our communications team within UK Health Security Agency, and that went all the way up to the office of the Prime Minister, who this week is Rishi Sunak. So it went up to the very top of government. And also professional organizations in health, environment, in property, in construction, in safety, many, many different organizations. So the publications in journals and in professional journals, as well as scientific journals, will appear over the next year. But in the meantime, we've had a lot of social media posts and people have picked up the press releases. So this is how it's appeared on in the press and on social media. You can see Twitter on the left, it appeared very quickly. And these are ones that have appeared over the last 2 days. People look for their local area. These have appeared in local news networks, local news online, and even made some national press as well. So radon hotspots. Many people still think that Southwest England is the only radon problem. And looking at some of the comments that have appeared on these articles, they are surprised that radon is a problem for them as well. So in conclusion, we've produced many, many maps since the 1980s. Each iteration has been more complicated and they all cause problems because they do influence many other areas such as construction, as in health and safety, and they do influence new laws that come out on, for instance, housing, health and safety. So the latest GB map is based on measurements in 560,000 homes. It's very detailed, it's very complicated, and we've added in the geology just to make life even more complicated. So communications and publication getting more difficult every single time. And with the new map just coming out, that's what I'm spending a lot of my day doing. So if you want to see what we've done and more information on radon maps and all the detail for the United Kingdom, go to ukradon.org. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for your very interesting presentation. I think I've heard the word complicated more than 10 times, but that's
absolutely
interesting, and that's something we can be discussed in the roundtable. There is one technical question about the geological map you use for the radon map with the very fine resolution of 25 meters. And the question, does your geological map allow such a high resolution?
Yeah, the geological map is at 50-meter resolution. And we have looked at the way that we buffer it. And they are so confident that at worst it is a 50-meter resolution. Sometimes it's down to a few centimeters resolution. So yes, it does allow such a detailed assessment, and we have assessed how well they are predicting the radon concentrations, and it's good. It's very good. Are there any plans to remap Northern Ireland? We will wait for more measurements to come through, and if there is a geological reclassification of Northern Ireland. We are trying to set some detailed criteria to show when exactly we will remap, because every time we release a new map, the question is, how long will this one last? When are we going to have a new one? So we're going to clearly define what criteria have to be satisfied in order to map an area anew.
And maybe talking about prediction, the last question is can you predict the effect of climate change on radon concentration? The question is about radon concentration, not radon potential.
Yeah,
I'll leave you with that.
Right, climate change, not so much, but we can see certainly the effect of energy efficiency measures on houses. And we have seen that increasing the energy efficiency measures, changing windows, insulation, is increasing the radon concentration quite significantly.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Tracy, for your presentation. I would like to call the last speaker. But stay here for the one table, Tracy. Don't
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, I'm not going away. I'm not going away.
Yeah, don't go away. Last speaker is Mr. Francesco Boccicchio. He's the head of the National Center for Radiation Protection and Computational Physics at the Italian National Institute of Health in Italy. And Francisco, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you in general to organizers for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm moving in some way to regulations regarding the optimization of radon in optimization of protection from radon, and so I will. My intention is to discuss in some way how optimization is applied and the problems in the optimization, particularly in the application of the principle of optimization, and also to try to contribute to the evolution of a radiation protection system with a proposal that will be given in this presentation. And a general warning: this presentation is obviously focused on radon, but some concepts, some consideration could also be useful for and applied also to other exposure situations. So just to remind what is very known in this context, the principle of optimization, and which contains in some way also the word ALARA, which is the name of this network. So the optimization contains the purpose to reduce the exposure in some way. And this is the definition from ICRP. And the optimization is a principle, so it needs adequate tools to be effectively implemented. And particularly ICRP in publication 103 introduced the tool of reference level, which is defined as below. So the reference level is a level above which it is just to be inappropriate to plan or to allow exposure to occur, and below which optimization or protection should be implemented. So this means that, of course, priority has to be given in remediation to a situation where the level is greater than action, than the reference level, but also but optimization has to be carried out also for levels below the reference level. So this is a graph just showing the difference between the reference level and the previously adopted action level concept. So on the left, with an action level, some remediation has to be considered only in case the level is above the action level. So in this case, for example, also if the level is just slightly below the action level, no intervention is required. Whereas with a reference level, with a concept of reference level, optimization has to be given with priority to levels above the reference level, but has to be given also for levels below the reference level. And I'm very happy that Jean-Luc is here, because this graph is derived in some way from one of his publications. What is the problem? The problem is that despite the clear definition of a reference level, actually the large majority of the countries implemented the reference level in their regulation, including the transposition of the directive, European Directive 59 of 2013, with the same meaning of the previous action level. In other way, not requiring any action or any significant action to optimize levels below the reference level. And in some cases, some countries adopted a reference level higher than the previously adopted action level. And so also considering that the log normal distribution of radon levels, this interpretation of the reference level actually results in a lower protection and in non-effective implementation of the principle of optimization, in contrast on what was the main purpose of the introduction of a reference level. So this situation it is in some way recognized also in the recent interesting publication from the European Commission about radon in workplaces, which deals, of course, with protection of radon in workplaces, but is focused on optimization of exposure above the reference level, although some consideration on optimization below the reference level is also included in this publication, which can be really downloaded as reported below. So what are the rationale that explain in some way the situation? And also it is on the basis of a proposal. Of course, it's difficult to implement optimization below the reference level without any guidance on which level should not require an optimization. So without any guidance on when to stop in optimizing. And moreover, it's also, we have to take into account that usually the levels are more, from a practical point of view, a level below which no action is required is much easier to be implemented than an unconstrained reference level, which required to do something below that one also. And we also get to take into account that there are quite different radon distribution of radon concentration, and moreover, also different remediation capabilities among countries, which will imply quite different capability to reduce radon levels to any given target value. So the proposal is to move from a one level approach with a reference level to a two levels approach. And the two levels are one, the actual reference level with the same meaning of ICRP 103, and we know that this level can be chosen by member state in Europe, but also for international basic safety standard within a maximum reference level established by the directive. But the proposal is to supplement this reference level with another level, a lower level, which could be called no action level, which is again a level that should be chosen by each member state. And this no action level is clearly intended to try to solve the problems described below. So with this proposal, optimization again has to be given with priority for radon levels above the reference level, but also for radon levels between the reference level and the no action level. And the remedial action should be aimed to reduce radon levels below the no action level. In this way, this approach has also the good point that increase the flexibility in the implementation of a regulation, both among countries, but also within a country. For example, among countries, we can take in account the different radon levels distribution, so using different no action levels, and again also considering the different capability to reduce radon levels in a high number of buildings. This also could be reflected in choosing different no action levels among countries, but also within a single country, this could give large flexibility, useful flexibility. For example, the requirements for remediation could be stronger for levels above reference level and less stronger or recommended or any other difference for levels between no action level and reference level. And also the urgency of remediation could be different for these two levels in these two regions. And finally, I think it is very interesting that the no action level is more related with the capability than to the risk. And so this no action level could be easily, in principle, reduced with time with the improving of a remediation capability of a country. So initially, a country could have a no action level, which is quite close to the reference level, but with the improving of remediation capability, a country could decide to reduce the no action level. So this approach, I think, is more in agreement with the principle of optimization, and will also is expected to be more effective in promoting remediation in a higher number of situations. So this is the similar graph than below that show the effect of using this approach. So you will have remediation also in these regions, and you will have no remediation only if you are below the no action level. This proposal seems also to me seems quite new in some way, but actually I discovered reading again and again and again the ICRP 103 that it was already included in this very basic and very important document. Particularly at the page 115, it is written that in addition to reference levels, regulatory authorities may also wish to specify levels at which protection against radon can be considered optimized so where no further action is needed. This is exactly the no action level that I propose in this approach. But unfortunately, this proposal was not, let me say, very developed and not used up to now. And so actually, I propose that it is really reconsidered at a regulation level. So in conclusion, taking account that the revision of a system of radiological protection should possibly contains more tools for an effective implementation of optimization principle, this proposal is aimed to give some contribution to this purpose, and adding a practical approach for implementation of optimization principle, which is more in agreement, in my opinion, with its definition and can be adapted to different remediation capabilities. Finally, similar consideration underlying this proposal, this approach could probably be applied also to other exposure situation where a reference level is used. So thank you very much for your attention. And this is my email address in case some of you will need to send or ask something about this proposal and the related arguments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boccicchio. Thank you for your presentation again and introducing this non-action level and putting it on the table. There's one question I can relay for you: which reference level will be proposed for the European members? And maybe a more direct question: which non-action levels could you propose for Italy, for example?
For Europe, I'm not the person that have this responsibility. So for reference level, it is already written in the directive, and I don't think it requires to be changed so much. But for no action level, I think, again, it strictly depends on the capability. So I think that a country which have, for example, not many companies able to reduce radon levels could start with a no action level, which is slightly high, let me say, not too much below the reference level. For example, if a reference level is 300, the no action level could be 200. But more and more the capability increase, this no action level could be easily reduced, and moving, for example, to 100 becquerel, which is the level recommended in some way by WHO.
Yes, indeed. And it's more a comment from Jean-François Lecomte. You mentioned him in your presentation. He said that, to his point of view, the management of radon is not only a matter of number, could be reference level or non-action level, it's also a matter of process. And in your non-action level system, or is it only a matter of numbers to manage radon? Is it sufficient, in your opinion? I think the idea of Jean-François, is it sufficient, in your opinion, to introduce a new number to drive through, again, to push, to have limited, to reduce the level of radon? Do you think it will be enough?
I think it will be a great help. Of course, any single action is really enough, but it will be a great help because we'll clearly say where to action and where not to action, which is actually what we are doing. But in most of the cases, actually, we are not acting nearly anything below the reference level. This is not correct, both from the individual point of view, so individual risk, because of course, treating a different way a situation which is slightly above or slightly below the reference level, but it is also not a good approach from the public health point of view, because considering the log normal distribution and the number of buildings exceeding the typical reference levels of 300 or 200 is usually a very minor percentage of total buildings where reducing radon is possible and can be effective.
In the chat, there are some comments that more or less the non-action level are maybe not applicable as such, especially in workplaces. There's a very long comment. Yeah, again, that also the management should be based also on the presence of workers, public occupation factors. So that's, I think that's, yeah, and again, the ratio versus radon versus radon progenies.
Yeah, so just let me try to, sorry, to add
Yes.
some further words about your previous question that probably I did not answer completely about if this no action level is enough for approaching the situation. Of course, in the region between no action level and reference level, you can use the same tools as graded approach and other approach that are usually considered up to now. But with the addition of the no action level, you can focus on the regions or levels instead of, in principle, dealing with all levels, including very, very low ones. So it's a tool, practical tool in order to obtain a more effective optimization.
Thank you for your details, Mr. Bokicchio. Maybe
thanks to you for pronouncing my surname correctly, which is not easy. My surname is correct, Bokicchio, but many people you pronounce Bociccio. But
no,
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
And maybe I can call the other speaker for the round table. We have, of course, we have prepared some questions for the speakers, and of course, the content of the presentation and the question in the chat were totally different from what we expected. So we can manage that. I think given the timing, we can do something like 20 to 25 minutes of just one table. Mr. Katarina is no, okay, but okay, sorry. So
Here on the
just, yes, it's perfect. So thank you again for all your presentations, and I think just having Jean-François presented the philosophy of the ICRP system with keywords like graded approach and integrated approach for the management of both radon and norm. And especially in the first presentation, all the presentation, we saw that it's complicated to measure the radon concentration or to assess the level of, I don't know, heavy chemicals in the works. It's complicated. So the question is, it's a generic question, but given all the complexity of the world, the real world, so to speak, is it, in your opinion, possible to have a pragmatic, a very practical approach to evaluate for the exposure assessment, which is the starting point of the optimization process? Is it even possible to measure exposure to radon and or norm efficiently and in a pragmatic way?
If I may start, yes, my feeling is that it is a first step. What we call in our jargon the characterization, it means concretely to make an assessment of the exposure. It could be in dose, it could be in concentration for radon and so on. But So it is the first step. And we have tools for that. Of course, it is not always easy, but we have to use the easiest tools. For example, for Radon, the easiest tool is concentration before to use the dose. And then this characterization allow for identify who is exposed where, when, and how, and to identify the priorities. And in terms of optimization, because the driving principle is optimization, and then we have to select these priorities and to adapt the protection strategy to that. And of course, we need to have an assessment in terms of numbers, using numbers, but the presentation and the chat shows that these numbers should be used with some caution. I mean, they are very useful to set the scene, to see where we are in a given situation, and to see what should be the endeavor to improve the situation, and where we have to take action. But both in NORM and in Radon, it should not be used as I would say as limits and so on, because each case is very particular. The number fit in one case, but not necessarily in another case. And what is important is to engage a process of improvement. For Radon, for example, we have to convince people to make measurement and to take and to make remediation if there is a room to make this remediation. And in case of NORM, we have to engage the responsible, and mainly the employers, the operating management, to avoid as much as possible the risk, and to decrease by I would say common action the level of this risk. And because when we focus on numbers, we could have difficulties just to remind the issue of dose coefficient for Radon, the issue of assessment, the characterization of material in NORM, and so on. It should be used just as benchmark to take action.
Thank you, Jean-François. And maybe, for the people who have presented a lot of numbers during this morning, Katarina, maybe you would like to be the first to answer.
Yes, if I may, you start on what Jean-François just said. Yes, for Radon, we want to persuade people to carry out measurements. We need these measurements to fulfill requirements of radon action plans and to create radon potential maps and so on. But we also have to ensure that there are companies capable to carry out the remedial actions in the houses which will be found to have elevated radon concentration. We know that there are quite easy mitigations or remedial actions available. They are well described, at least for the European countries, but still we have only few companies, even maybe one single company per country, capable to carry out high quality, efficient remedial action. And this is what has to, we have to change it somehow, or the market should change. I know that in the UK, this is not the issue. In several other countries, even with high radon averages in the houses, this is the issue, and they are lacking in this part of the building building industry. And it is still quite difficult to engage the building industry in radon mitigations. And I fully agree with what Jean-Francois said, that at the beginning, when it is a, let's say, new case, like we are entering a new workplace. So screening measurements are the one which are usually cheap because we can use passive detectors. And then if the annual average or the long-term measurement is above the reference level, then we go to deeper measurements, characterizing in better way the site and the exposure of workers. And it may happen that we have to calculate the effective dose, and but the majority will be connected to only these quite simple measurements. But definitely we will end up with a few very specific examples or workplaces or dwellings, non-workplaces having quite high concentration of radon or presence of other radionuclides, and we need to do a detailed measurements to better calculate or assess the effective dose, to reduce the conservative assessments, which we do somewhere in the middle, because we at some workplaces we need to make these detailed measurements to improve the calculation, saying whether the limits are exceeded or not. And these few percents of workplaces requires these detailed procedures, detailed measurements, and detailed calculations. And these are quite costly at this moment, at least. Thank you.
My feeling is that detailed measurements are very useful to know if there is a room for improvement. But using these measurements to have a detailed assessment of the dose, to be in compliance with dose limit and so on, I am not sure it is the better way. For radon, is an issue at the level of the building, not at the level of the people. You have to try to avoid that radon enter in the building and to get it out if it is inside. That is the real core of the radon policy. Those limits, we don't need of that, my feeling.
Some workplaces cannot be like ventilated, for example, because of they are like national heritages or so, and you cannot install these sumps or forced ventilation. And so it's only a limited number, I know, definitely only a limited number of workplaces, but some of them, the only possibility are the organizational measures, not the technical, on the side of the radon source. Just my comment.
Yeah, and speaking about assessment, whether it could be a concentration or dose, I would like to address a question to Tracy and Marta. You presented the difficulties in the assessment of the risk with your works, which are chemicals and heavy metals plus uranium. So there is really an issue with the assessment, and also a question to Tracy. You make a map, more and more detailed and complicated map, but you have an idea in mind. I mean, it's for radon remediation optimization purposes, isn't it? And how does the map enter in the optimization process? And question to Marta, how does the assessment, risk assessment enter in the remediation process? How do we deal with that?
Okay, I'll go first with the radon map. It has multiple purposes. It has a purpose to encourage people to do radon measurements in the first place, whether they are in their own home, whether they are a landlord who is renting out a particular building. That's actually in part of regulations. And also for an employer, that's also part of regulations. You do what is called a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. If you own a radon affected area, that will include undertaking a radon measurement. So it's at the measurement side, it's at the preventive side. So it's part of the building regulations. You look at the radon map. Do I need to do radon preventive work at the construction stage? But once you have those measurements, then the map is not important, because you have your individual measurement in your own home. Then you are encouraged to do radon mitigation. If you are a landlord or an employer, then you are required to do mitigation. You are required to reduce the radon concentration. And the way our regulations work, as soon as you have a high radon concentration in a workplace, the regulations apply. You are expected to do mitigation immediately. It's mitigation first, dose assessment second. So you notify to your regulator, the health and safety executive, that you have a high radon concentration. They might then call you on a telephone or turn up at your premises and say, right, what are you doing about it? And then you have to do the mitigation as soon as you possibly can. And what the regulator is also starting to do now, as part of any other building inspection, is we know that you have a high radon concentration, or you used to have, and we know that you put a mitigation system in. Is it still working? Has it been maintained? And there are actually prosecutions going through the system now for people who have not maintained their mitigation system. The fan has failed, nobody replaced it. And that has caused all sorts of ripple effects, all sorts of ructions. People are suddenly going, radon, I remember that. And with the new map coming out, yeah, the new map drives all the publicity. It's our big thing that we show to people. Are you in a radon affected area? What have you done about it? What are you still doing about it? Have you thought about it recently? And if you did a measurement 10 years ago, has your building changed? Have you put new insulation in, new windows, for instance, changed your heating system, gone to an air pump rather than a gas to radiator system? Redo the radon measurements. So it's our big driving thing. It is everything for us. It's when everybody talks about radon, the picture they show them is the radon map. And it's based on 200 becquerel per meter cubed, and just to be awkward, then we also have our target level of 100 becquerel per meter cubed that we do not map, but that's for individual optimization. That's for mitigation work, and it's also a new action level for people who are active smokers or used to smoke. They are at higher individual risk. So rather than trying to do a risk assessment or an individual dose assessment, say, are you above 100 becquerel per meter cubed? Then you need to mitigate, even though you're below 200 in your own home. But we don't use any extra action levels for workplaces. We have to only put what is in law. We did try that for schools and other publicly occupied buildings, such as residential homes for elderly or disabled adults. That got complicated. That's my favorite word of the day. It was not enforceable by the regulator, so it's actually caused a problem. As far as mines are concerned, we don't have big problems with the chemical in the mines. We don't have uranium mines, or at least not active ones. So we tend to just stick with the radon gas concentration. If they maintain a high radon concentration, the ventilation is difficult, then we'll do radon daughter measurements as well to give us the equilibrium factor. And that they do need an estimate of the equilibrium factor when they are using personal dosimetry. So I think that was everything. Back to Marta.
Thank you. When it comes to risk assessment, I think this is also linked up to measurements and characterization. As I said, some of these our challenging rocks may have a very low content of uranium, down to 0.3%, 0.3 becquerels per gram. But when you do assessment of the environment, we can see extreme values of uranium. I think one of the most extreme values was up to 2,000 micrograms per liter of uranium in filtered water close to this very low, rocks with very low levels of uranium. So you can't just take a look at the shale and say, okay, this is so low that we don't have to do any assessment of it, because measurements of the environment may show that that it's actually quite high pollution from it. And of course, when it comes to risk assessment, we ask the responsible party to do a risk assessment. But one of the challenges is that we have very few consultants with knowledge of this field. So they can perhaps just look at the shales and say, oh, this is so low, this is no problem. And then we can ask, well, check for uranium. And they find some uranium, and a couple of years later, no, there's no uranium, and it's gone magical. It's just vanished. And of course, we as a regulator, we know that uranium doesn't just vanish. So we may ask them, check more. And more time goes, and suddenly they found all the uranium out in the environment, leached out into marshes and the forest. So it is difficult for us to make the responsible party to actually do the risk assessment, not necessarily because they don't want to, but because of the knowledge is quite limited from our perspective. And also looking through this Pobet diagram, it's even the most complicated I showed are extremely simple compared to what we actually see in the environment, with all the other colloids and species that may occur. So it is very challenging. But we ask the responsible party to do a risk assessment, and then we do an assessment if we agree with their risk assessment. If we don't, then we ask for more information. And also it's quite difficult as most of these kind of legacy NORM sites are out in forests and fields, and it's if we are to reduce exposure of people, it would just say, okay, don't go there. But then you also have the biota, and since we don't have those limits for biota, it's difficult to actually say when should we do remediation. So then we have to look at projected ecosystem effects and the like. But I totally agree. It's challenging. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. You mentioned, and I think I will relay this question towards the panel. You mentioned the case of elevated uranium concentration in one places, and generic question: is this level of concentration leads automatically to being a planned exposure situation? Or the generic question is there which practice, which norm situation could be deemed automatically? We don't speak about regulation now because there's a directive in between, but to your opinion, which norm situation could be deemed automatically as a planned exposure situation? And yes, and how it will influence the optimization principle after that?
I think one of the most difficult things for me is that we don't have defined, planned and existing exposure situations in our legislation. So we don't actually, it's not explicitly stated that this is planned and this is existing. But from I understand that planned exposure situation would be situations where a NORM facility has discharges and applies for discharges, while an existing should be NORM. But I think these legacy sites where you have a development of discharges which is not legal, I think that too is difficult because it has elements for both planned and also existing exposure situation. But if, for instance, this one case that I was talking about, if they had applied for a permit, they would not get it. So it wouldn't fall into the plans. That is, they will never get an approval to do discharge this amount of radionuclides into this particular environment. I think it's very challenging, and I don't think it's a very clear case in these cases if it's a planned or existing, because you can always make a discussion that it may be one or both or neither, perhaps not neither, but one of these. I think you can argue for both.
Okay, very interesting. So it's more a matter of discussion. And does anyone have also some specific challenges to highlight, whether to decide whether a situation is exposure versus a planned?
If I think about the UK regulations, it doesn't really coincide well with planned and existing. What it does is you do a measurement. Do you have a problem? And the regulations are very much about sorting out a problem, and they don't let you or don't prompt you to decide whether that was an existing situation or a planned situation. It's just, you have a problem, manage it, fix it as far as you possibly can. And if you cannot fix it, then you need to manage it in the long term. And that is because our regulations have evolved from the first ionizing radiations regulations, which were 1985. And they are in just about every way consistent with the European Basic Safety Standards of 2013. But they don't specifically ask employers to decide whether it's a planned or an existing exposure. They just say, you have these various different reference levels, now fix it. There are also links into the chemical monitoring. And if it's something like uranium monitoring, that definitely comes under the chemical side, at least as much as the radiation side. So looking for contamination, whether it be uranium and legacy radium sites. There were a lot of sites where people were painting radium dials on clocks and other instruments prior to 1945. And these sites are just found all over the place. They were part of almost a secret industry, and the records of those in little tiny industries, sometimes one person in one small house or outbuilding, those records have been lost, and they are just found at random sometimes now during monitoring for other things. A building I knew, we just thought maybe the geology looks interesting, let's do some radon measurements there, and it was found to have massive radium contamination. And asking around the local area, somebody said, yeah, we remember somebody doing some radium dial painting many years ago. My grandfather said about this. So we have legacy sites where it might have been planned by somebody, but not somebody recently. So do you say that's existing because it's radium contamination that's already there when you found it, or that somebody planned it some years ago? So sometimes the ICRP philosophy and how it has gone through to the basic safety standards doesn't quite align with people's normal thinking, normal situation, normal practical way of dealing with what they have.
Thank you. And someone in the chat also mentioned that there's the ICRP, there's also the IEA and scare coefficient. There's different recommendation and proposal in between the philosophy and the field, so to speak. Yeah, it's complicated. And Mr. Bokiko, maybe one question for you, the non-action level. Do you see it differently, whether it is an existing or planned exposure situation, or is the difference existing versus plan not important? And should we manage, as in the UK, should we solve the problem, whatever the type of situation? You are still muted.
You're right. Thanks. Thank you for the question. I tend to be agree with Tracy. So giving more importance to the practical solution of a problem than to the definition of a situation. Although, of course, for preparing a system, the definition and framework is very important. But for specific cases, it's more important to decide which is the best way to solve, to fix the problem. In this context, I think that there is no, I don't see any difference for the no action level for planned or existing situation, and in general for dwellings or workplaces. This tool can be adopted in the same way for both the two situations. And I also would like to say what I also already wrote in the chat, that what is important is not how we call this further level, no action level, or any other way we could call it. What is important is to have two different levels. The lower one can be called the target level, can be called the action level, can be called in any way. But what it is important is to have two levels in order to clearly ask that optimization is carried out in case with different priority and so on, both above the reference level, but also below. This is the basic point, the most important point. And some countries already have this two-level approach. So it's not a new idea. It's just a good idea that is asked to be extended.
Thank you very much. It's almost noon. Does anyone in the panel has any final thought, any idea he would like to put on the table? Yeah, Jean-François.
Yes, thank you. Perhaps just a few words. The type of exposure situation introduced by ICRP, it is not an administrative framework. The question is not to put one situation in one box or in another in terms of regulation and so on. It is a way to help to make a graded approach in the strategy, and we have to recognize that the way we manage I would say the classical industries with radiation, I mean mainly nuclear industry, we could have a graded approach, but this graded approach is a little bit too narrow for including some other situations, and Radon and NORM are concerned about that. Two examples: if we consider with Radon and NORM exposure that all workers exposed to Radon or NORM should be considered as occupationally exposed, something is wrong. For another example, for residues and waste, we need to have a margin of maneuver broader for example, waste from NORM. Coming from nuclear industries, it is mainly a matter of activity concentration. And from NORM, we have also the issue of volume and so on. We have to adapt the protection. And in this way, we can make a distinction between different families of situation. It is why ICRP introduced the type of exposure situation, but it is not a strong cutting between administrative categories, not at all. Thank you.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Yes, but sometimes the regulation wants to put boundaries, more evident, more apparent boundaries. But that may be the topic for another webinar. I really would like, yes, to thank deeply the panel for your time, your presentation, the high standards of your presentation. It was really, really extremely interesting. I also would like to thank the participants who managed to keep up for this quite long webinar. Franz, maybe he's here or not, but thanks. I would like to thank him for chairing the session, and the first part, and Karin, which is the hidden guardian angel of this webinar in the backup. Yes, thank you, Karin. Would not have been possible without you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any final words? Otherwise, I will bluntly shut down this webinar. Otherwise,
thank you very much, and goodbye.
Yes, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very
Goodbye.
much for organizing this meeting. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for joining. Bye.
Thank you. It's been really interesting.